the extent to which morality plays a role in identity in prison populations in particular is an ongoing question and relevant to our interest in the psychology of good and evil. Some estimates say 30% of the prison population is above the cutoff for clinical psychopathy. And another relevant statistic is that 77% of people who qualify as psychopaths in the US are incarcerated. So, if we want to understand morality, identity, and criminal justice, understanding moral identity and psychopathy is a reasonable step in the right direction.
So what is psychopathy? Glenn and colleagues describe psychopathic traits that include superficial charm, manipulativeness, callousness, dishonesty, a lack of guilt, emotional shallowness, stimulation seeking, and antisocial behavior, including taking advantage of others, lying, cheating, and abandoning relationships. And current research suggests that psychopathic traits exist on a continuum in the general population. So we can measure individual differences in psychopathy in self-reports. Glenn and colleagues were interested in the possibility that the moral deficits associated with psychopathy might actually be caused by a lack of moral identity. So a failure to define the self in the way that Strominger and Nichols' research showed us that people normally do, in terms of moral traits.
In one set of studies, Glenn and colleagues examined how self-reported psychopathic traits are related to moral identity in the general population. So this is not a prison population. In study one, they measured the self-importance of moral identity. So they asked about 9 moral traits, such as being fair, being hardworking, and they asked how important these were to the person's self. The questions gauged internalization. For example, quote, being someone who has these characteristics is an important part of who I am. And they also gauged symbolization of the moral traits. For example, quote, the fact that I have these characteristics is communicated to others by my membership in certain organizations. So, to internalize moral traits indicates a person equates the self with the moral attributes, regardless of the influence of anyone around them. To symbolize moral traits indicates a person is living out that moral trait in the world, and that's how it manifests through social interactions, not within their inner selves. They also measured moral identity with the adapted good self-assessment. This moral identity instrument uses a diagram with 3 concentric circles labeled very important to me at the core to not important to me at the edges. Participants select a spot on the diagram for each of 8 moral traits and 8 pragmatic traits. The moral traits include being honest, considerate, helpful, sympathetic, generous, sincere, fair, and dependable. And the pragmatic traits include athletic, imaginative, industrious, outgoing, funny, logical, independent, energetic. And participants for each trait would select how important the trait was to them by selecting a spot on that diagram. And they measured psychopathy with Levinson's self-report psychopathy scale. This scale has a number of dimensions in 2 overall factors. There's the interpersonal affective factor, which includes measures of callousness, manipulativeness, and lack of guilt or remorse. The second factor is the lifestyle antisocial factor, and this includes impulsiveness, antisocial behavior, and irresponsibility. So the scale gives 2 factors which are in alignment with the psychopathy checklist from Hare, which is the gold standard interview to assess psychopathy. Their study asked the question, are psychopathic traits related to moral identity, that internalization and symbolization of moral traits, and the importance of moral traits? Psychopathy was indeed related to moral identity. So the box here shows total psychopathy score, and the correlation that's significant there is between psychopathy and the moral identity measure average. So the more moral identity shown by the participants, the lower they scored in psychopathy. Moreover, both internalization and symbolization subscale scores predicted reduced psychopathy. So, both being someone who was less likely to say that having these characteristics is an important part of me, and someone who is less likely to say that I have these characteristics and they're communicated to others by my membership in organizations, these people were more likely to be psychopathic. To get more specific about the kind of psychopathy that was related to moral identity, we can see here that both internalization and symbolization and the average score for moral identity predicted reduced psychopathy in the interpersonal affective factor. So, reduced callousness, manipulativeness, and more guilt and remorse when people were more likely to endorse these moral identity elements. Reduced moral identity, so less symbolization, less internalization, was also related to the lifestyle antisocial dimension of psychopathy, so that impulsiveness, antisocial behavior, irresponsibility. But as you can see, the effect was smaller than the interpersonal affective factor.